My name is Natalie Haslam and I work at GMCVO. I'm one of the project managers on the Health and Social Care VCSE engagement project, and I carry out that role alongside Beth, who's also on this call. And as part of our team, we've also got Kat, who is the senior admin person who sorts out all of the events and comms. And then not on this call, we also have Hannah Berry and Vicky Mayer, who do a lot of the work around the Greater Manchester Equality Alliance, which is one element of our project delivery. And supporting our work as well, we've had Emma from 10GM. And she is the kind of the link person for our project into the various localities around GM as part of her role. So between us, we're the team that help make this project work happen, and it's all based around providing opportunities for the VCSE sector to be engaged in, involved in, contributing to the health and social care world in Greater Manchester, particularly off the back of devolution that happened in 2016, and a memorandum of understanding that was signed between the VCSE sector and the Health and Social Care Partnership. So we collectively try and make that agreement happen alongside our colleagues that make up the VCSE leadership group, which you may or may not have heard of. If you want any more information about that group, then let us know and we'll pass on the details. But there are a few members of that group in the room, including GMCVO. We sit on that group. So you may or may not have come to the first session that we held about integrated care systems development in Greater Manchester, which was held earlier this year. This is actually a follow-up session, but don't worry too much if you didn't come to that first one, because things have moved on since then, and there's plenty of opportunity to contribute to discussions today. So the event earlier in the year introduced where thinking was up to at that point in Greater Manchester with regard to implementing changes to the kind of arrangements around health and social care delivery that were set out in the NHS England's white paper, and mainly centering on the development of a statutory integrated health and care system. And we began at that session to explore what this might mean for VCSE organisations that were involved in delivering or wanting to contribute towards health and social care delivery, either at a Greater Manchester or at a locality level. We'll hear more on where things are up to from Warren Heppeler, who's also on our call. Hi, Warren. And just to say that since then, members of the VCSE leadership group have been involved in some of the workshops to develop what the new operating model might look like in Greater Manchester. And Warren can provide a bit of an update on that later on. So just to say that today's session, we're looking to explore some examples of how things are happening in a couple of localities. So we've got Dave from Bolton and Liz from giving an update on Tameside as to examples of how VCSE organisations are getting involved in those localities that might give you ideas about how things can happen where you operate. And from that, we will go into discussions looking at how our project and other local infrastructure organisations can help to provide some practical tools and support to you as VCSE organisations wanting to engage in those structures. And then also to develop some clear asks of our colleagues within the GM system to help enable VCSE organisations to participate. So that's kind of what we're going to try and cover in the next just under 2 hours. So, you know, no mean feat to try tangle with some of those tricky things, but hopefully we'll be able to to get somewhere by the end of this session. So with that, I will go on to our first presentation section. So hearing from some VCSE perspectives on engaging with locality health systems. And we'll hear from Dave Bevitt, who is the VCSE sector commissioning lead from Bolton CVS.
Thank you. Hi, hello everybody. My name is Dave Bevitt. As mentioned, I'm the VCSE Commissioning Development Lead, actually funded through health, but employed by Bolton CVS. So clearly this little sort of presentation will be really a bit of commissioning heavy, perhaps, or commissioning focused, but that's the role. I've had 20 years experience of a chief officer at Citizens Advice in Bury, and prior to that with Citizens Advice Manchester as a partnership manager, and that involved working with health, probation, the prison service, and so a big range of different commissioners. And in Bury, I was involved very much with the VCS infrastructure in Bury, in fact a few times over actually. But way back in the mist of time, I was a welfare rights advisor with a hospital social work team. And I think that's where I first came across the divide and who pays for what and is this health or social care. I saw that very clearly in the hospital setting. And I think that's partly what we're sort of starting to see resolved through the developing of joint commissioning across the piece, which is great. My current role is essentially to help improve the communication between commissioners and VCSE organisations. I started in January, and I've spoken to VCSE groups of all shapes and sizes across Bolton to get their take on the current commissioning and funding climate. And it's certainly worth remembering from the State of the Sector survey that the vast majority of the groups in Bolton, and in fact across Greater Manchester, are very small community-based organisations. I also speak to commissioners from the CCG and the local authority and the Hospital Foundation Trust to get their take on the sector and about how we engage and what barriers they saw to participation and engaging with us. So I guess just to sort of sum up some of those discussions, the first thing from the VCSE, the first thing I got, it's complicated. So for all the groups, when I asked who they dealt with as funders, they all gave different names. There's a real patchwork of commissioning and funding that often developed over the years and was based around existing relationships and often historical decisions that have sort of been adapted and changed over the years. Now, this can clearly be an asset because the best joint working is where relationships are strong, but it can also prevent some innovation or newcomers into the market. So that was interesting. Many groups just don't have the resources to engage with commissioners, and many may not want to. But I think as neighbourhood working is developed and the importance of small local networks of support through things like luncheon clubs, befriending, sports clubs, allotment groups, these are all essential in creating strong community. So it's really about how we can make them more secure and make it easier for them. And in Bolton, the Bolton Fund's been set up, which has been really welcomed, and it's themed. And groups who need help with governance or similar can get expert help. And so it supports new and existing provision and can be vital in supporting local initiatives. But as with all grant funding, it often doesn't provide the long-term revenue reassurance that people could really do with. That was a sort of a small part of the take from the sector, really. Talking to commissioners, I think there was a recognition that commissioning pathways certainly aren't always clear, to say the least. I think prior to COVID, there was quite a lot of work being done on trying to get a strategic approach to commissioners from the three key commissioning organisations in Bolton. I think that had been disrupted understandably by other concerns, but there was certainly a willingness to get that back on track and a recognition of the need to take a unified approach across all the services. There's a great deal of enthusiasm for working with the sector, for co-design, for social value, among the commissioners, and a recognition that services need to fit round individuals rather than the other way round. I think sometimes definitions of social value and co-design are perhaps up for discussion. Sometimes people had different takes on those things. But there was an increasing understanding of the importance of strong communities and early interventions. And I think sometimes commissioners actually knew what they wanted to do, but didn't know how to do it. So particularly with smaller groups, so offering solutions to that, maybe pushing an open door, I think. Commissioners sometimes felt there was an element of duplication in our sector, which is perhaps fair enough, and that sometimes the sector was reluctant to change and perhaps slow to challenge itself, which I think, you know, we all need to do that, whatever organisation we're in. So I think that's something that we do need to take on board. To be honest, though, one of the strongest and lasting messages from all the commissioners is that there's no money. So I think that really is sort of a difficulty with what people want to achieve and their ability to achieve it. So I think it's even more important we make sure that money's spent in the right ways. So a summary, I guess, it's a good time to be having these conversations now. There's a new procurement bill out, and I think there's some flexing going on as we leave lockdown, I think. So I think that gives us some opportunities. I think there was a growing understanding of the importance of strong communities and the need to support early intervention. I think that's becoming quite widely accepted. I think it's important for us to support allies in statutory agencies who take that view and be supportive to them. The strength of the sector massively demonstrated through COVID, the mobilisation of volunteers and etc. And I think we need to build on that. And I think to some extent there's been a bit of a sharp intake of breath from the statutory sector as to how well we can mobilise. So I think that's important. Collaboration again is a key to this, to avoid duplication and to support some of our smaller organisations who don't have the resources to do their own bid writing, can't go and sit and look at things on the chest. I think we need to look at models of collaboration that can bring them in to not more formally, but more supported in the system. And finally, I think it's about challenge, really, both to commissioners and to ourselves, to, you know, something we've all been round and round, matching the rhetoric to the actions. And so it feels to me that that's challenge and conversations are key to all of this. So I hope that was okay. That's a rough summary of where we've been. I appreciate, as I say, it was very commissioning heavy, but that's where I've been looking recently. So thank you.
Thanks, Dave. We'll hear from Liz next, and then if anybody's got any questions for either Dave or Liz, we'll do that after both presentations. So Liz, over to you.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Just going to share my screen for a minute or two, but just to say my name's Liz and I'm from Action Together, and we're the local infrastructure organisation in Oldham, Rochdale and in Tameside. But for the purpose of this, I'm talking about Tameside and Glossop and the integrated care approaches or plans afoot that covers those two areas. So I'm going to share my screen, see if this works. There we go, we're just pressing share now. Can you see it? It should be quite a bright coloured document.
Yes, we can see it.
Fabulous, thank you. So this is the Tameside Council's corporate plan and the Tameside and Glossop's plan. And this is their kind of strategic priorities, really. And I guess this presentation has been put together and it's working its way through the system in Tameside and Glossop. And it's very much kind of a draft stage, and it's a consultation kind of tool that parts of the system are using. So I wanted to share it with you today. I'm going to just highlight where the voluntary sector in Tameside, I think, is included in some of the current thinking and modelling, and also where we think some of the gaps are and where our concentration is going to be moving forward. And I know we've got a few minutes, so I'll do that quickly. So I wanted to reflect, I suppose, one of the most significant things which we are pleased about is that, similar to the kind of GM commissioning framework that's there across the GM system, Tameside has its own pact, and that's something a bit similar to what David was saying before around it's a kind of a piece of work that we've done, which is about the relationships and ways of working between the system, public sector partners and the voluntary sector. And in terms of the approach at the very heart of the thinking around the ICS in Tameside and Glossop, it has included what we agreed as our pact principles. And I think that's an important starting place in terms of the recognition of what the sector expects. I think in terms of the plans afoot, so as in virtually every area, Tameside and Glossop proposed to have an integrated care board, and the voluntary sector through Action Together is represented the membership of that. So it's got some thoughts really about who that membership is, and the voluntary sector representation is there as part of the modelling of the initial membership. And then within that, the different subgroups and arrangements to get us to that place. So I suppose what's important, I think, is that the voluntary sector is seen as a strategic partner in whatever arrangements move forward. So there's that commitment. And within the modelling, at every level, whether that's at the neighbourhood level, reconfiguration, or through what they're describing as the provider collaborative, the voluntary sector has seats around all of those those tables as well. And I think that's a really important starting place for our work moving forward together. The only other thing I wanted to show you then was about the provider collaborative, because I think we're fairly clear in the system at Tameside and Glossop that it is going to be really important to get the framework, the way in which the provider collaborative works and what it works on has got to be kind of central to, I think, central to the success of any of that remodelling. And so it's important that we are there as part of that provider collaborative. And I have this on this last slide. This is still in draft form, so it is out for consultation. But you can see that it's the sector is also represented as part of that provider collaborative. I think that gives us good opportunities, but it's also an area where we've got to balance out how best we engage and work with that provider collaborative. And we're just thinking through whether it's best to have representation, as it's described here as the VCSE Alliance, or whether it's best to have a range of providers that cover the suite, kind of the range of other services, i.e. the voluntary sector that contributes to mental health, the voluntary sector that contributes to end of life, also around those tables. How do we ensure that we have both a sectoral space as a provider, but also then some service specific space that considers what the voluntary sector offer is. So that, I think I'll stop sharing. I don't know how to stop sharing that, but I will stop sharing my slides. I think in terms of, so I think that's a good starting place. And I think it shows that the voluntary sector is highly regarded in Tameside and Glossop. And I think, you know, it's what we would expect to see in terms of the kind of strength of our relationship in any of the modelling moving forward. There is a key kind of decision-making partnership called the Strategic Executive, which we are also part of. And so that's really where a lot of this shaping is happening. So it's good to see that we as Action Together are able to be in some of those spaces. I think there is more work for us to do to really engage with the broader sector in Tameside and in Glossop about what this really means in practice. We're all thinking, I think, within this modelling and these changes, how do we ensure that population health and tackling inequalities is a meaningful endeavour, so that it's certainly there as the principles and ways of working, but how do we ensure that the structural changes really support that? And you know, I think we've still got a way to go as a system to really try and work that through. Where will the accountability for that really sit within the new structures? I'm really interested to see how we can really support direct engagement from the voluntary sector into these new structures. So in some ways, it's good that Action Together is invited around the tables, but as you well know, we're not the sector. We need to find those direct routes through, and that trust to be built across the whole of the system for the voluntary sector to engage directly. We have been earmarked some funding to have a resource that is going to help the sector to engage in this way. So similar to David in Bolton, there will be, we hope, a resource, and the CCG have committed a part-time resource to support that. We're interested in what's the role for Healthwatch, patient voice, patient experience, how do we make sure that's built in? And so that's another lens of ours. Action Together, part of our offer in the family of Action Together, we do run the Healthwatch services in Tameside and in Oldham as well. So that's also part of our lens. And then the last thing that we're thinking through is how do we really start to think through the risks of what was commissioned directly from the CCG in Tameside. So what services that the voluntary sector deliver are potentially at risk with any potential changes. So we need to start to map that out and to think through how to mitigate some of those risks. I'll pause there. I don't know if that was 5 minutes, probably a bit more, but I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Thank you, Liz. So if anyone wants to ask questions, they can either raise a hand, use the function on Zoom, or just type a question into the chat for either David or Liz. Beth?
Sorry, start pressing buttons. Thank you both, that was really interesting. I've got a question for each of you. Dave, I wanted to ask, with all, if during all those conversations with frontline VCSE organisations around commissioning and the commissioning landscape, are there any really clear sort of kind of concerns or priorities that have been raised? What would they be? That are more common across the board. And then my question for Liz was about, sorry, I don't know what's making all these noises. And my question for Liz was about, because you've got an overview over 3 localities, without naming any names, assuming they're all at different places, what are the things where these proposals are developing at pace? What are the sort of characteristics and conditions that have enabled that to happen in those places?
Okay, well, if I go first then, I think, to be honest, one of the issues, now I guess this isn't just Bolton really, is obviously the council are having to reduce their funding considerably. So at the same time that there's a lot of positive conversations and a lot of willing engagement going on, there's a reality that's somewhat different. And I think some people in the sector struggle to reconcile the two. Are we really being asked to step up and do more at the same time as having the resources to do it reduced, which is a reasonable question, but I think it's not necessarily a matter of, it's obviously where local authority finances are. So I think that's actually quite a big issue around trust and around, what actually happens on the ground. So I think that came up quite a lot. I think the other was particularly with smaller organisations, let's say, I think the way that this worked quite a lot was talking to someone who was sort of ran a big size sort of community activity, and then drilling down to the people who used that and ran the supper club or didn't have premises, and particularly coming back from COVID, there was a lot of, well, how are we going to manage in terms of space, in terms of premises, in terms of so just those I think the challenge was really going beyond the people who have a voice already and are very willing to use it. And I think that applies to a lot of the discussions with about getting the voice of the community. People who want to be heard will come forward and be heard, but there's a whole group of activities that people aren't necessarily, they don't particularly think they have anything to say. And I think the challenge is getting down to some of those smaller organisations. And I do think some of our middle-sized charities perhaps have a role in that. So yeah, that was it. But I think there is a reality here of reduced funding at the same time as a bigger ask on the sector, and that's quite hard to square, really.
I'll try and tackle your really difficult question, Beth. So I'll do what I can, but please come back if I've kind of done a waffling sort of politician answer here. But I think to be written into the thinking from the beginning, has, in my view, has got to point to an ongoing relationship where there is trust, and that the role that the sector plays is integral to the solutions that are needed into the future. And I think in all the localities, Rochdale, Oldham and Tameside, that's embedded. Rochdale's, we're much newer to working in Rochdale, but I think the work that has been done across well, through COVID and before, but certainly through COVID, has really demonstrated that it's an invaluable part of the system, and money has recently followed that message, and there is a new 800,000 fund to the voluntary sector through what's called the Repair Recovery Fund. Again, Oldham is talking about strategic investment into the voluntary sector, really has committed quite a lot of its resources over the last year where it can. I mean, I'm not saying I wouldn't want more, and there's still not a long way to go in many of those examples. But there are significant programs that connect us to the health system as much as through other parts of the public sector system, and that's really developed relationships. So I think the other thing is that I would say in all of those authorities, in those localities, there are people within the system that are as passionate about population health and tackling inequalities as we are. And I think that we share really similar ground when we're talking about prevention, when we're talking about the broader suite of population health initiatives and the role of the voluntary sector. And when we're thinking really about tackling inequalities, you know, we used to sit as a fairly lone voice around some of the health and wellbeing boards in that space, but that's no longer the case. And I think, you know, all three authorities, and I would say particularly Rochdale and Oldham in this space, are really leaning into the challenge of tackling inequalities. That's not to say they've got the solutions, but I think that there's some real energy behind honest, hard truths to be faced within the different systems. And I think that that has given, you know, again, we need to, the role of the voluntary sector and the faith sector is critical in tackling those inequalities. So I think for those reasons, I think it's those circumstances which really help us where we are. But we probably need the luxury of all of them to really push ahead, because there's still there's daily and there's still challenges, considerable challenges for our sectors in those localities, as well as those positive starting places.
Thanks, Liz. Unless there are any other burning questions, we will move on to our first discussion session. So we're going to send you into random breakout rooms, and then the first question is around what are the practical tools and support that are needed for your own and other VCSE organisations to be connected in with integrated care systems, either at a Greater Manchester or your own locality, if you work within a particular patch in Greater Manchester. So we're looking at what support from the likes of Action Together or our project or other organisations that might be able to support you as a VCSE organisation to get more involved. So we're looking at practical tools and support that's needed, and each room will have someone who's going to take some notes and feedback. So you'll have about 15 minutes for that. See you back in the main room shortly. think we've got everyone back. Yes. I thought I'd slightly tweak the agenda to do feedback directly from these discussions now before we do a quick comfort break and into the second question, rather than doing it all as one big kind of feedback session. So I will go round in room order. So room number 1. Is that Liz, was it?
Yeah, that was us, I think. So in our group, we had a pincer movement. There were 3 against 2, 3 infrastructure organisations there with the kind of with there in terms of how can we help, and so that left for kind of Judy and Caroline to kind of think through from their perspectives what it is that they most wanted to kind of raise. And I'll try and do a summary, but you know, if either of them wants to chip in, you know, use your own voices to put that forward. But I think one of the questions which I think came from the last session and wanted to be brought forward to this is that how do we think about engagement with our voluntary sector, not just through locality perspective, but also communities of identity and interest, and how do we make sure we keep challenging ourselves to think about those organisations that help to connect around a shared interest, but don't necessarily connect into particular localities. There was a kind of a ask, particularly around Trafford, in that I think they wanted to really to see their authorities investing more in the infrastructure space so that they had more of a resource locally that can help them do some of that connection. And then there was also some kind of questions that we were just starting to pose at the end, which I think are probably useful foods for thought in terms of when we are in those spaces for engagement and trying to influence, what is it that we want to bring to the table in terms of what the sector's offer is. And we got to the role of our sector through with its insight and its connection to people, and the role of our sector as providers, and the role of our sector as systems change agents to think about population health and tackling inequality. So that's where we got to in our discussion.
Thank you, Liz. Room 2, who's that?
That was me.
Beth.
So we had a mix of, we had GM, some of GM and locality. So a mix in our room. But in terms of the practical things that would support the engagement of the VCSE sector in developing ICSs, we talked about the need for sort of defined roles for sort of smaller niche providers, you know, potentially within a system that's going to give a voice to larger providers. How do you make sure those organisations operating across more than one locality, but providing a specialist service or working with one of those marginalised communities is still part of the picture? There was something about articulating the sort of, I guess it's the kind of environment that we're working in as the VCSE sector, but also articulating the what the VCSE sector brings to the table. So there's a role for some practical support in being able to talk about added value, the pressures the sector's under, so you're not always having to have the same conversation over and over again. And then we had a bit of a conversation about engagement and having the right relationships and getting the right voices around the table, and you know, practical support and facilitating that, and making sure that that happens and that happens well. And I mentioned, you know, that's something that we've done a lot of work on over the last few years, something that we'll take with us, looking at how we best support involvement in the structures from now on. We have Warren in our group, but he didn't get a chance to talk, so I don't know if he wants to add anything or anyone else from the group does.
I can just carry on collecting my thoughts because I get a chance later on, so I don't mind adding in. I was kind of making a few notes that I'll be able to play in at 3 o'clock.
Thanks, Warren. Sorry, didn't mean to drop you in there.
Thanks, Beth. Room 3. Is that Emma?
Is that me? Yeah.
I think so.
My whiteboard did save, but I can't find where it's saved to on my laptop. So this is going to be me from memory until I can track down those notes. So again, we had a bit of a mixture. We had people kind of operating specialist services, but at GM level. We had people operating services at City of Manchester level, and also someone from Manchester Foundation Trust, so a really good mix. So we talked about volunteers at the beginning, actually, and volunteer sharing. And with the move to a place-based system, is there a way that we can make sure that the VCSE sector stays connected and that actually skilled volunteers with kind of specialist knowledge can actually be kind of shared and placed better in different parts of the health and care system, and how we kind of, you know, what might be some of the practicalities of doing that. We taught a bit about the kind of general levels of engagement so far, and there was a bit of a feeling that the VCSE sector maybe hasn't had that full opportunity to engage in some of these ICS development conversations so far. Certainly for some of those kind of more specialist providers working cross GM who are not kind of directly linked into a locality. So thinking about what opportunities over the coming weeks and months are there going to be to do that. We also would like to see more detail around how patient voice and patient groups will be represented both in the development of the ICS structures, and then once the ICS structures are fully operational, what will be the kind of practical ways in which patient voice is represented and patients are engaged, and really important that that's not just the usual suspects. And then again, echoing one of the previous points, how do we make sure that if there are limited spaces at some of those decision-making tables, that we're able to represent the breadth and diversity of the VCSE sector, particularly those micro, pure volunteer-run groups that aren't necessarily going to have the, you know, the time or the resource to be engaging in these structures that are actually quite fundamental to their existence or their ability to keep on providing the services that they provide. If I've forgotten anything, please pipe up, anyone in my group.
Thanks, Emma. And finally, Kat from Room 4.
Yes, so we, our room was entirely VCSE based, some local, some national. What was interesting was that there were some clear messages that were coming out regardless of, if you like, the geography of the space. So let me just go back to my document. So we talked about perhaps needing a better understanding of who is playing what role across GM city region wide in this particular process. There were some questions around, in practical terms, what's going to happen to things like specialist commissioning units, for example. Do we know whether the system is going to be centralized or it is more local as it is now, and maybe some clarity around that. There was an agreement that it's easier to find access to people and information at locality level, but that it's harder to interact at GM level and to sort of know what's going on. And one conversation in particular was around what happens if an area of interest is not a priority. So it becomes that much harder to engage and influence from the set-off. And we had the example of neurology, where we know how things are being commissioned right now, but moving forward, it's not really clear how the commissioning will take place. And there was a mention that only one ICS across the country actually specifically mentions neurology. So what happens when you're not in the room where the conversation starts? With an addition of even speaking to neurology specialists, they themselves are kind of struggling to understand how the new system will operate. There's something around needing a better engagement process across Greater Manchester in terms of what people are doing and sort of where they're at, and really echoing some of what Emma was saying. If you're a smaller organization, when you already have a day-to-day job and then have to navigate the complexity of this, it is incredibly time consuming, and it's not really easy to navigate at the moment. And that is also an ask, not just to the ICS people in the room, as it were, but to the VCSE sector itself. So how do we work better together so that nobody has to go to all the meetings? How do we sort of bring all the information together and disseminate it in a way that is actually quite clear and transparent? And that was us.
Thank you, Kat. Some really interesting stuff has come out of that, and actually there's quite a lot of similarities between the feedback from the rooms. So we are going to have a quick comfort break now. So just take 5 minutes, and then I know that a few people have left, so our numbers have dropped. So what we might do is shorten the next discussion session with slightly fewer rooms, and then we'll get on to hearing from Warren and his thoughts on what he's heard so far, and a bit of an update from GM. So 5 minutes, just comfort break, and then come back and we'll go into discussion too. So thanks. There we go. Right, I think most people are back now. So we'll move on to our second discussion session. We've lost a few people, so what we thought we'd do is have fewer rooms with slightly more of you in each room. So you'll be going into one of 2 breakout rooms now. I do know that some of the feedback suggested that you were moving on to talk about this anyway, so hopefully it'll just be building on the conversation that you already started in your first discussion room. So what we wanted to get you to answer this time was our project mainly focuses on connecting VCSE organisations into the Greater Manchester system as it exists now. So we wanted to ask you to think about, what can we ask Greater Manchester Systems to do to enable VCSE participation in the new integrated health and care arrangements. So it's some really clear asks that I guess Warren can have a think about and maybe take back to some of his colleagues, and any other connections that we have within Greater Manchester systems, we can make those key asks of people. So Kat will now send you off into a room for just over 10 minutes, then we'll come back for some feedback, and then we'll move on to Warren's presentation. So see you all shortly. You can carry on that thought in the feedback later.
Lost in the east. Lost.
Liz was just about to make a really punchy grand point at the end and got sent back to the main room. But with that, do you want to go first at summing up the feedback?
Yeah, I feel like I've spoken a lot in this. I'm really sorry. It feels I have tried to write some notes there, but it's actually quite a broad discussion that we've just had. I think there's certainly we got into thinking about the role of our sector as specialists, not just as parts of the sector that works on tackling prevention, that offers prevention. And we were thinking through maybe there needs to be ways of connecting in areas of similarities around conditions or in expertise, as well as the voluntary sector itself. There was mentions around making sure we don't get stuck in particular boxes as a sector. There's also really interesting discussion around the system using, not necessarily intentionally, we didn't kind of, I suppose that the emphasis of this was that the structural changes should not stop or be the reason for certain kind of decommissioning decisions to take place. So we need to ensure that there's greater transparency and clarity of some of those decisions. And Warren gave a good suggestion, I think, around really trying to agree some points of continuity that we would expect as a sector. What is it that we expect that should continue? in terms of some of the relationships, and also particularly around some of the areas of work that we think commitments have been made that we should really hold on strongly to. There was then some questions around how do we make sure that there's engagement in each locality from GM into each both local infrastructure organisation, but also make sure that that engagement is real in each locality, and that is not just for the lucky few in some localities. Yeah, I'll stop there. That I think is the main emphasis of it.
Thanks, Liz. And who's doing feedback from the other room?
Kat's got the notes, I think.
Yes, and happy to say they've actually saved. So let me just bring them up. There was a really, really, really strong winner in the room, as it were, in terms of realizing sort of that vision and having that resource in place to have a VCSE commissioning link in each of the localities. And a good few organizations were able to mention the work that's currently happening in Bolton and Tameside, and just how useful having that go-to person actually is. That was followed by a question mark in terms of how would that add value across the city region, bearing in mind that each locality is at a different level with different commissioning services. So how could you bring all of that together from a city region perspective? And let me just bear with me while I go back to the document. Some general comments around how do we untangle chaos in a system and trying to kind of get it to come together. So could we maybe have more clarity around the purpose, the function, the money, and really the general landscape? And the final point that all of us made in the room was that because the experience is very hugely in different boroughs, how do you then bring them together with a strategic plan? How is it going to work? And perhaps the key question is, how will we know what's going to work at GM level and what's going to work at locality level? Bearing in mind that even at locality level, we are sometimes talking around place-based work in neighbourhoods. So how do you bring all of that together strategically was the key ask.
Thanks, Kat. With that, pretty much bang on 3 o'clock. We'll move on to Warren, who's Executive Lead for Strategy and System Development at the Health Social Care Partnership, and has been involved in conversations with the sector for a long time on this. So we'll hear from him an update and then some reflections on what you've heard, Warren, throughout the session so far. So over to you. Okay,
thanks for that. And it's felt like a good discussion actually, because I was thinking of the I don't know, it feels I've come away with quite a kind of clear list of considerations that if we'd done this in the way that we often do this kind of thing, which is for me to do show and tell up front of people to react, I'm not sure we would have drawn out the same kind of depth of information. So it's I've kind of filled quite a few pages here with stuff that I think collectively and together we probably need to find a way of addressing. And it was down on the agenda as a bit of update and a bit of reflections, and I'll kind of do it in that order. But in the update, I kind of want a bit of a reflection in that, because one of the things that really worries me about the changes that we're about to go through is the extent to which the kind of system approaches the change as if it's like a restore to factory settings moment, and we just we clean everything out and then start designing again, and nobody can locate themselves or the history of their relationship or what was understood about the contribution that they make, and that would be catastrophic for us. So one of the things that's felt really important in the conversations that we've been having across the statutory sector through this set of changes, that it's kind of really important for colleagues in the VCSE to hear as well, is the extent to which we'll do this really successfully if we see it as a moment in a journey that we're already on. rather than a major change. Because the truth is, I think we have to drive for a process that secures continuity of the right things to continue through this set of changes. Because the truth is that there is one specific technical, practical, actual change that occurs, which is the establishment of a legal entity for the NHS at the Greater Manchester level that will be called the NHS Integrated Care System body. And that will incorporate the functions of 10 CCGs. But what can't change is a set of approaches around neighbourhood and place-based working that brings, primary care, social care, the VCSE, NHS providers together at the neighbourhood level. And that'll be the point of connection to the reality of how people access and receive support and care in the context of how they live their lives, and that will be the most of what happens at a day-to-day level. There will still be locality level governance and leadership, and that'll still need to connect across all of the local partners. And the local partners will still be the council, the VCSE, local NHS trust, primary care partners, and there'll be a thing that's called the ICS that will actually play out locally as well. So the ICS will cover the whole of Greater Manchester, but it won't purely be a Greater Manchester entity. There'll be part of its activity and its people that will be deployed in the 10 districts. So there has to be kind of footholds from the way that we work now and the people that we work with, and the rationale that underpins that joint work that'll have to sustain through this set of changes. I think there'll be a couple of, and there are, I think, in terms of updating on where we're getting to in this process. I think there are a couple of what might class as kind of wicked issues. So I think colleagues will feel like we don't know what we're walking towards yet. Nobody's written it down. Nobody's set it out, and that's probably true. What I don't want you to think is that somebody sat on that description and isn't sharing it, because the truth is, if you were in one of our local authorities at the moment, actually if you're one of our CCGs or even one of our trusts at the moment, everybody will be thinking, we're not quite sure what this new world looks like yet, because nobody's written it down. And there is partly to do with the fact that it's dependent on legislation that has not yet arrived and guidance that's not yet been published. But the bottom line is we'll be creating this as we're managing the change, which is why that point I made at the start about let's hook into the relationships that we've got. Let the legislative change and the organisational structures reset themselves around them, but let's not lose the core of the relationships and the purpose that we're driving towards. I think then in terms of the kind of the key reflections, I think there is something about not missing where we've moved the relationship on over the course of the last 4 or 5 years in particular. So I think, and we've got a bit of evidence to confirm this as well, the role of the VCSE in a model of transformative health and care is more recognised and understood now than it was 5 or 6 years ago. I think we've got more examples, I think we've got more evidence, I think we've got more stories, and I think we've got stronger relationships. I recognise that that's not true in every part of Greater Manchester and across every potential service area, but we've definitely got more of that to be able to tell than we did before. I still think that the part to kind of focus on is probably still the more of the kind of hyper-local place-based relationships, because I think the closer we get to this, the more emphasis will start to be placed on the model, the ways of working and the model of working at the neighbourhood level. I think some of the approaches that colleagues set out earlier on in the conversation gave me a bit of heart, because I'd be worried if there weren't examples now of some of that transition governance starting to come to life and people not being connected to it. So Lizzie's example up front of being able to show that picture that could have come from, you know, the chief exec of the trust or the chief exec of the council, and they'd be using exactly the same slides, but being able to describe how the VCSE is patched into that is really significant. And we need to be kind of proactive now in setting up the conversations that will sustain the relationship through the transition. So a version of that slide in terms of the transition governance, the transition conversation in each of the 10 districts should be something that we all feel that we can connect to. And I would say we need to mirror and mimic exactly the same thing in terms of the conversations that we have at the Greater Manchester level as well. So we need the GM version of Lizzie's slide. I think then in terms of the conversations that we had, and as we went through both of those, with one with I suppose more of a kind of local lens and one with more of a GM lens, I still felt like some of the kind of the core material in the relationship doesn't actually change that much. I think it's the same stuff either played at a GM level or a local level. So you've still got the bits that make a difference, and I think it was interesting that in the first conversation, when the words kind of support and tools were kind of used to prompt the conversation, actually everybody started with relationships. So I think there's a comfort in looking for support and tools, but it'll never deliver as much as the quality of the relationships. So I think we'll end up relying on where those relationships are strong. I also think it's worth us thinking about the advocates, and you know, in the same way as we think sometimes about the role of allies in things like race equality, I think there is something about advocates from the statutory sector to where you know that somebody's speaking on your behalf, even when you're not in the room. And it's happening more often. So I think there's something about finding those people that you know will champion the sector from inside the statutory sector as well. I think there is something about not missing the opportunity of gathering together the evidence and the stories of where the sector's made a difference, because I use a few examples where I've that have occurred over the last few years, where I think the involvement of the sector shifted people's perception of what was attainable in the model. And one of the ones I use, and there'd be loads that we could pick on, is the work that we did on mentally healthy schools, where I think there was a kind of drag and drop model that was being pushed through the NHS nationally. It was an intensely clinical model, and it was just seeing a few practitioners that were stretched across schools. And actually, it was the VCS conversation that kind of blew the doors open on that, and said, actually, there is a social and emotional model that you could reach for here beyond the clinical, and we think we can deliver it for you. And the fact that we've taken that on the road and shifted the conversation nationally on the back of that. So I think the ability to tell some of those stories and be really self-confident about the fact that the VCSE isn't a supplement to statutory services. VCSE is delivering stuff that you cannot create and you can't operate from within the statutory sector. So it's fundamentally additional, and we can't be timid about describing that additionality, because the truth is the offer of the sector goes beyond the capability of the statutory sector. So I just think gathering some of those stories together about so it's less to do with support and tools than it is to do in some occasions with kind of self-confident representation from the sector itself. And then I think when we got into what helps in terms of developing those relationships, I think there are some really specific and critical things that we probably need to act on now. I think first is that the route for engagement, and recognising that that's kind of two-way really. There is definitely something about the statutory sector needing to open the doors and say, right, this is the place where we'll have the conversation. And there is something else about who we have the conversation with in a sector as complicated as the VCSE. So there, you know, that step that we took 5 or 6 years ago in the establishment of the leadership group and the approach to coordinating the sectors and its representation, and for that to be trusted through the sector it has been both sort of radical and quite powerful, I think. So that thing of saying, well, actually, we'll open our doors as the statutory sector to speak to the VCSE, but you know, who picks up the phone on the other side, and how do we know that they're representative of the sector? So there's a bit of organisation of the sector to come in that part. I think the other bit is that I guess we've got to say, you can't worry too much about the lack of clarity on the ICS or what it will be, because it just isn't there. So I think we've just got to go with a more sort of self-confident representation of whatever it is, it needs this in the middle of it, and then put that forward, and just make sure that you're kind of planting the seeds for the people to kind of come back to when we get to that point in the design. I think there's a really important bit about helping and I suppose improving the literacy in the statutory sector of how it sees the VCSE. And this came up in the second conversation in particular around both the kind of generalist elements of the VCSE and the specialist elements of the VCSE, and how you're selective in which parts of the statutory sector you might need to strengthen the relationships with. So I think there is something about a kind of sector-to-sector leadership conversation which could be quite general. I think there is something else about the role of some of the specialist organisations in the VCSE being part of the model of care in a specialist sense. And, you know, neurology was an example that was used, and you could say the same in the context of you know, of cancer care or specialist mental health provision. But I think the sector almost kind of organising itself, and again, it's a point about self-confidence, about saying actually we should be part of this provider collaborative, because we think we're offering something that is essential for the outcome, but isn't delivered through the statutory sector. And then the last point that Liz made in the feedback, which it hadn't occurred to me before, but I do think it's probably a bit of a marker that is worth putting down now, on making sure that we've got a really clear sense of the things that we think should sail through this transition untouched, unmolested, unreformed, and not reduced. So I think getting a really clear sense of we've got X, Y, and Z up and running at the Greater Manchester level, or in an individual district, and having the agreement either in the locality or across GM to say this will continue, won't it, beyond April 22, and it'll be part of the future, whatever the transition looks like. And I just think listing some of those things and making sure that we're protecting some of the the sort of family silver in this relationship as we go forward. So hope that's helpful. I think we probably, if we can do it, I think we probably need to keep this conversation going, because the bit that I think it would help us to stay on the front foot of is as some of the detail of the changes kind of emerge, at least we can test ourselves against whether we're kind of keeping the good things going, tackling some of the issues, but helping each other through the change with minimum disruption, really, because I do think we've come a long way in the last 4 or 5 years, and we've got to try and maintain a kind of an upwards trajectory on that, rather than risk taking 2 steps back and having to recover ground from 2017 or 2018 or whatever, because of a set of external changes where I think it probably is within our capabilities to be able to find a smoother way through this set of changes. So I'll stop there if that's okay.
Thank you, Warren. Does anyone have, we've got just a few minutes, if anyone's got a question to Warren, just off the back of that presentation. Well, not really presentation, but thoughts on reflections. Liz?
Thanks, Warren. I thought it was really helpful, actually, and you have a way of putting it so so helpfully and clearly together. So thank you, I really appreciate that. The two things that sort of, I suppose, that you've raised, which I think is, actually I wanted just to reflect a bit more on, is this kind of idea of the allies, because I think if you have allies in the system, yes, you've had to foster them over time, but there's also a fair amount of luck in that. So I know, for example, in Tameside and Glossop, that the people holding the pen of the system change and integration within Tameside and Glossop absolutely understand the voluntary sector and are those advocates when we're not in the room. I can't say that in all of the localities we work in, but and I know that in some localities, those allies just don't exist, or they're not necessarily holding the pen, that they're also trying to influence in other ways. So there's just something about, if that's not there, what can we do? How can we help some of the allies in the right parts of the system influence across? I don't know, that's one of them. And then the other is around routes for engagement, really. And I think that sometimes we kind of get put in place as a representative of others. And, you know, I suppose I'm really conscious that our role, particularly as Action Together, is to be a conduit to. So there needs to be lots of different dialogue and spaces for connection. And our role, I think, is to have the relationships to make the connections, but that does put on the system quite a lot of emphasis that real energy needs to be taken to reach the diverse and complex nature of our system, and that actually what we've got is sometimes very limited time for that engagement and to do it meaningfully. So we end up as a byproduct, a representative of, but really we should hold firm to being conduits to the real, you know, to the parts of the sector that others can't reach.
Yeah, because I think on that first point, I'm not sure I've got a smarter or better answer than us kind of sharing the state of the current conversations, you know, place by place, sort of theme by theme, across Greater Manchester and connecting to each of the localities, and then maybe assessing where we think some of the allies or the kind of advocacy might be helpful. I think when we've confronted some of those issues before about variation and used things like you know, sort of shared frameworks that set certain expectations, sometimes it helps a bit, but I still think it feels like all it does is very often is it just plays into the places that we're already convinced. It deepens the relationships in places that we're already convinced, rather than actually addresses the cold spots. But I do think at least step one is us sort of staying close and making sure we're identifying where some of those conversations aren't happening and where some of that support might be. I do think there's a bit of an exercise we could go through that might help us firstly kind of capture some of the progress of the last few years, but offer the sort of maybe some of the richness of the sector in different perspectives, and then start to plot out where we think some of the critical future relationships will be. And it could be on the basis of infrastructure organisations, of representative organisations, or of specialist organisations that are you know, providing elements of specific support in specific areas, and make sure that we're plotting them into the less general and more specific conversations. Because the one place where I think that feels like we've got it almost kind of top to bottom is in mental health, where I think there's almost no conversation I have around leadership on mental health delivery, coordination of major programs of work that doesn't have the sector represented, and the depth of the representation is really quite significant. But that won't be the same in all areas of kind of care and support, but it's not a bad thing to aim for. And I think we could probably do with you know, almost a bit of a tabletop exercise of saying, I suppose, kind of representing the sector and then testing its kind of roots and connections in different bits of the system going forward. I think that'd be a really good test of how many bases were covered, and whether the sort of the breadth and richness of the sector is understood and connected in the way that we organise the work.
Did anyone else have a question before I wrap things up for the session? No, I think there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of heavy thinking for the last nearly 2 hours. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to those that have presented and facilitated and given up their time this afternoon to these really important conversations. As Warren suggested, this will be one part of a continuation of conversations whilst the developments are happening. We've got a focus for the next kind of 5 or 6 months of our project work to look at enabling the engagement of the VCSE sector in these developments. So I think one of the next steps for us as a wider project team is to kind of digest the notes and actions that have come out of today and the suggestions that have been made, and then put a little bit of a plan together as to what we can put some time and energy and resources towards to try and get some more regular communication about progress out to the sector, to get an up-to-date kind of lay of the land across each of the localities and GM, including any kind of key link people, so that those names and allies are known out in the sector as widely as possible. And then we follow up in another couple of months with a similar discussion to this, and see where we're up to, and reflect again on things, and then move forward for the next couple of months after that and see where we get to. So they're kind of my thoughts on what we can do next, but it's I think a lot to digest and then come up with a bit of an action plan, and then we'll feed that back to anyone that's contributed to the sessions that we've had so far. So thank you very much for that. I think just before we finish, Kat is just going to flash up a quick set of questions that'll act a little bit like an evaluation for us, just so we get an idea of how the session has gone today. But again, I'll just wrap up by saying thank you very much and hope to see you all soon.